Get this, adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Wondery. greenlight.com/Wondery.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. One purchased equals one donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, we finish our look at the RaDonda Vaught case. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my mellifluous co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. It's so good to be back with you. Did I cover up the fact that I don't know what word you just said?
Yeah, that one was a tough one. I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly or not, but it means having a pleasant and fluid sound, flowing as with honey.
I mean, it was a great word. It flowed.
Yeah.
But I was like, I don't know what he just said, but it was so pretty.
Mellifluous.
Say that
Mellifluous.
again.
Mellifluous.
Okay. Now we both know a word.
Now we know a word. We can use it whenever we want. And it applies wonderfully to you, Alice, whose voice flows like honey across the podcast airwaves into the ears of all our listeners.
Was that like a slap or a clap back at all the people who say that we perpetually sound like we have nasal infections?
I think it was. I mean, I'm trying to, ignore the haters and the trolls more, but I gotta, sometimes I just have to push back a little bit. Everybody knows, Alice, that you're wonderful.
Back. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we do
got
get
your
sick.
back. I mean,
we can't help it.
Yeah, we got an army of listeners out there who love your nasal voice, so I don't want to hear any complaints about it. So, and I mean, I'm always sick, so they gotta enjoy my sick voice as well.
I think when you have kids in daycare, you just have to be okay with the fact you'll be sick for approximately 48 months, until you have another kid and then that kid goes to daycare.
Yeah, it's pretty much constant. I don't know how people do it. I mean, this whole being a parent thing is hard because you are constantly sick, and yet you have to act like you're not, or at least, you can't. Back when you were single, or when you were married and didn't have kids and you were sick, you just took a nap. You know, you just slept in. You just said, I'm not going to go to work today. I'm just gonna sleep in. When you have kids, you can't do that. You can't do that anymore. So I think that's part of the problem. But anyway, I'm not complaining because I love my kids. But man, there is and when you're old like I am, you know, we waited to have kids and now I'm really old. And if I was in my 20s, this would probably be a lot easier.
A lot of things were easier when I was younger, like walking upstairs and probably having sleepless nights when I used to pull all-nighters for law school.
It's true. Yeah, I don't do many all-nighters anymore. But I think that's enough about our personal lives. Nobody wants to hear about us. They want to hear about RaDonda Vaught. And we are back again to talk more about this very controversial case. I just want to say, as we start off, thank you to all of you out there who've been listening to this and have chimed in on the conversation. The discussions on the gallery have been fantastic. You guys have been there. We got a lot of people out there who are nurses, they're in the nursing field, different doctors, practitioners who have a real understanding of this. And what's interesting is there is a division between people in the medical community. If you've been reading the headlines, what you see a lot of is nurses who are very upset about this decision and about what happened. And I'm not saying there aren't people who are very upset about that on the gallery. There are, but we're also seeing some of the other voices of nurses and people who've been in similar situations and have looked at the things we're going to look at today, because we're going to talk more today about what RaDonda Vaught actually did and the shortcomings in what she actually did. We're going to talk more about that. And we've had a lot of nurses who've said, look, you look at what she did, and they basically agree with what I said at the end of the last episode, that whatever you think about the system in general and general problems, when it comes to what she did, it does seem to fit the criteria for a crime. There are other people who completely disagreed with that. There are people who thought, no way. There's no way she should have been charged with this. There's no way that she should be held criminally liable. And I totally get it. This is an intense case. And it's a case, unlike a lot of the cases we talk about, you know, when we're talking about murderers and kidnappers and everything else, there's a distance there. You know, hopefully none of you guys out there are involved in any of those activities. But this hits much closer to home for a lot of people. And so there's a lot more emotion, but it's been great to see people handle that emotion and have these conversations with a lot of respect.
Yeah, Brett. And, you know, I think people have a lot of strong emotions about the case, but more often than not, we have people writing to us with real legal questions about this case because they're worried about their own potential liability, either in their fields or a field that they're thinking about going into. And there are lots of questions, and we're going to try to dive into some of them today, but know that this is a special case, right? There's a reason that it's caused so much uproar. It is not every day that you see a case like this criminally prosecuted. Now, civilly for medical malpractice, I think that actually happens quite a bit. I think most hospitals, or maybe every hospital, has to have some sort of medical malpractice insurance because of that very thing. But civil lawsuits, very different than criminal liability, where someone's liberties are taken away because you can be obviously sent to prison. So we will try to answer some of your questions as to, you know, what happened in this case and who all should be liable and who can be held liable.
And one of those questions that a lot of people have asked is, what about the hospital? There's been a lot of people who feel like the hospital is just as responsible for what happened as RaDonda Vaught is. And there have been some questions. Why isn't the hospital held accountable for its role in this? And this is a really interesting legal question. I think we can talk practically about this at first. I mean, the practical reason is, you know, you try and charge a corporation. Who are you charging? Who represents that corporation? Proving that's going to be much more difficult. Obviously, the corporation has immense resources to defend itself. Figuring out exactly what to charge them with. What are you going to get on the back end, even if you get a conviction? There's a lot of practical reasons to not go forward with that, particularly when you have a person who seems to be responsible in large degree for what happened. So to what extent do you want to try to do that? That's an interesting question in of itself. But just addressing the legal question, can you prosecute a corporation for homicide in this case? The first thing you should know is you can charge corporations criminally. Corporations can be charged criminally. As many of you know, corporations are people too. And that may seem strange to you, but corporations, the whole corporation means a body, right? And so the idea is you have this business entity that, even though it's a business, is treated for the purposes of the law as if it were a person. So it can do things like enter into contracts, just like a person. It has free speech rights, just like a person. It can be sued, just like a person. And it can, in certain circumstances, be held criminally liable. This was a question that came up at the turn of the 20th century. The corporate form really came into being in the 1800s and really became what it is today as that century came to an end. And you think about all these huge corporations, the railroads, Standard Oil, things like that were coming into being, and you had things like antitrust law, just all sorts of development in the law to deal with these new entities, these huge new entities. And Supreme Court took a look at this and decided, yes, corporations can be held criminally liable in certain circumstances. And there was this whole idea of respondent superior, which is, the individual people at the bottom are the ones who pulled the levers or pushed the buttons or whatever. But if they're doing it at the behest of this big corporation, and the corporation is really the one driving the train, then it's going to be the corporation that can be held responsible. Where you often see this, and where it makes the most sense, are things like fraud and financial crimes, right? Because you can understand if a person is using a corporation and a corporation is using a person to defraud someone, then you can charge the corporation as well as the person. And it makes sense because really in fraud schemes, one of the things you're looking at are things like restitution and things like forfeiture of the ill-gotten gains. And if all that's going to the corporation, it makes sense to charge the corporation, and you can punish them, right? You can't put a corporation in jail.
And that's really interesting because while corporations are people for purposes of criminal liability, and there shouldn't be a different standard legally for charging or prosecuting corporations. An interesting thing about this is, as we all know, corporations are not actually living, breathing things. They are made up of individuals. There's usually a board, there's, officers, employees, directors, presidents, what have you. And when you charge a corporation, it does not necessarily mean that you're charging the people who make up the corporation, even though it's the individual's actions who probably helped perpetrate the fraud. So you have to charge the corporation and then the individual people. If you wanted to charge, by charging the corporation, you don't automatically charge the people who work for the corporation. And I make that distinction for you as we further talk about what it means to charge a corporation with criminal liability. And so, in other words, prosecuting a corporation is not a substitute for prosecuting culpable individuals within or outside of a corporation. Those are different entities for purposes of prosecution. So if you're going after the president who used the corporation and the corporation is also liable, those are two different entities for purposes of charging, both the president and the entity, the corporation.
And because of corporations and how they're structured and how big they are and how divided power is and divided responsibilities, you can also imagine how there might be many crimes for which it is basically impossible to charge a person. There's usually somebody who's driving the bus on any criminal operation, but you have a big company that's breaking the law. It's possible that it's breaking the law, but the people who are responsible for that only have a part of it. So you can't really point to a single person for which the entirety of the crime attaches to them, where they had the mens rea, the state of mind necessary for the entire crime, the intent. They may not have received anything. All the things you need for a crime. You might have all these different people who have one part of it, but only the corporation has the whole thing. And if you couldn't charge the corporation at all, then you essentially could have crimes being committed, but nobody is ever held responsible. So it's important to have this ability to charge a corporation. It's the same thing with civil liability. One of the reasons you want a corporation is to protect individuals from civil liability. You form a corporation, and that way, if something goes wrong, you sue the corporation. It's their assets that are at stake, not the individual people who make up the corporation. But you don't want that to turn into you can act with impunity because nobody's ever going to suffer because of that. Charging a corporation with manslaughter is another step altogether, and the courts have been rather suspect of charging corporations with that kind of thing. But it has happened. The first time it happened was actually all the way back in 1917. As I said, that turn of the century is when a lot of this is getting fleshed out in New Jersey. And it was a railroad case. And those of you who are lawyers are probably laughing because it seems like half the law is railroad cases. Railroads were so big, they were so pervasive, they were in every state, they crossed states, and so much of our law comes from things that happened involving railroads. And this is just another example of that. You had a railroad that was charged with involuntary manslaughter because of an accident that occurred that resulted in someone's death. And you can kind of see the similarity between that case and what we have here. Here we have a hospital where someone died. Everyone agrees this is an accident. Everyone agrees it's an involuntary manslaughter situation. And so the question becomes, could you hold the hospital responsible? Couple things about that. As you probably know by now, the laws are different in every state. In the United States, for those of you who are not from around here, there are 50 states. Each state has its own laws and its own independence. In many ways, the United States is unlike any other country. I know a lot of countries have provinces or states, and those have some power, but I think there's basically no other country where the constituent parts of the country have as much power as the states have in the United States. And so in the United States, the criminal laws are all very different. And there's the federal law, which covers all states, but it's limited. There's not really federal murder. You can have federal murder in some instances, but very few. Usually, if a murder occurs, it's going to be governed by state law. So in this case, we've been talking about Tennessee. Now, while the Supreme Court of the United States and I think 19 or 20 states have held that corporations can be charged with murder, Tennessee is not one of them. So this would be, and that's not to say that you couldn't do it in Tennessee. It's just Tennessee, it's never happened such that the Supreme Court of Tennessee had to decide, does our statute reach this far? Can a corporation be charged? So if you did that in this case and charged the hospital, yeah, that would be yet another sort of game-changing, groundbreaking piece of criminal litigation.
It'd be something that's new, right? We always talk about finding the right vehicle, the right factual pattern vehicle to push the law in a way that we think maybe it hasn't developed in whatever your jurisdiction is, but you always want the right case with the right facts to push it. And if this is already going to push kind of all the buttons, right? It's holding someone for their inaction criminally liable. You don't necessarily want to push all the buttons at the same time because courts are slow moving and for good reason. We don't want our courts to turn on a dime. You don't want today's law to all of a sudden be 180 something different tomorrow. We need the law to move slowly so that you can see how it plays out in real lives, boots on the ground, how facts apply to the law. And there's reason that courts are careful in considering, especially a superior court like the Tennessee Supreme Court. They want to see how it develops over many cases, over many years, before they make a decision in theory that could affect people's lives. And so you can imagine a prosecutor taking this into account, recognizing that the Tennessee Supreme Court has not yet recognized or had to deal with this issue, so they've never faced the issue, and that they may not want this to be the first issue that the courts have to face within their state.
And Alice makes a good point. When you bring a case like this, and this may seem strange to some of you when we talk about looking for vehicles to make a point, but that is something that happens. Remember, one of the purposes of the law is deterrence. That's one of the purposes of the law, is deterrence. You want to deter crime. You're not just punishing crime. You hope that by prosecuting cases, you will deter future crimes. So it is simply a fact that there are times when people are charged for crimes as much to prevent future crime as to punish what they did. So to a certain extent, that might feel unfair. It might feel unfair that RaDonda Vaught might be one of those cases where prosecution has decided, it's 50-50 whether we go forward on this. But the thing that tips us over the scale is we really need to deter this kind of action in the future. It might feel unfair, but that is a legitimate reason to have these kind of prosecutions. But Alice points out you need the factual situation to be correct. So think about, could Vanderbilt be charged? Like, imagine Tennessee said, okay, fine, involuntary manslaughter, you can charge a corporation. What do you need to show? And we talked about RaDonda Vaught. We're going to talk about her more. Essentially, you need to show the same thing. You need to show that the corporation knew or should have known, or took actions or didn't take actions that it should have taken, that a reasonable person would know could lead to great harm. And you're going to see the things that RaDonda Vaught did that might fit that. You need to be able to show similar things for the corporation itself.
That's absolutely right, Brett. And now, there is the doctrine of respondeat superior, which basically says that a corporation can be held liable for its agent's actions. In other words, what RaDonda Vaught did wrong can be attributed to the hospital as a whole. But think about this. This hospital is huge. Think about the number of nurses, employees, doctors, contractors, other staff members that they have on staff. And I don't know the number before me, but it is much, much bigger than just one nurse. And so while the hospital could be held liable for one individual's actions, likely because you are charging an entire corporation, you have to determine, can you show that there is a pervasiveness of that type of criminal conduct across the hospital? Not for one employee, not for one nurse, because just one nurse, if you look at the whole pool of people who work there, may be so diluted in a way that one person's bad actions, the hospital can argue, is just that, one bad actor. When you employ thousands of people, are you going to have a bad, actor within there? Likely. Does that then mean that the criminal act is so pervasive across the entire hospital that the corporation, the hospital, should be held liable? And so the prosecutor, in some ways, would have to prove the RaDonda Vaught case over and over and over and over and over again among many different nurses or other practitioners. In this case, it probably have to be other nurses, in order to show the pervasiveness of the culture to hold the hospital liable. And I bet you it was already really hard to come up with kind of this vehicle of a case, the RaDonda Vaught case, specifically to prosecute this. We talked about this last time, that this kind of was a perfect case for the prosecutors to prosecute because she used her own words to basically convict herself, right? She admitted fault, all the things that we said you want your practitioner to do if they messed up. But she said all those things, and she essentially used her own words to help the prosecutors meet the criminal elements of what they were charging her with. Are they going to find a RaDonda Vaught multiple times throughout that hospital? Unlikely. I would be surprised if that were the case, because there probably would be much more internal investigation or investigation by the medical board if all of a sudden you had hundreds or even dozens of your nurses admitting to the type of conduct that RaDonda admitted to after she had realized her fatal mistake. If you don't have multiple RaDonda Vaught's, then you put the prosecutors in a position where they have to be probably investigating for years in order to build their case against the corporation. And instead, you have a family, a victim here who is now dead, and a family who is advocating for justice on behalf of their loved one who has died from this mistake. They're not wanting to wait years for some investigation to potentially be able to bring a case against a hospital. They probably want fast action. And here, RaDonda Vaught's own words are exactly what the prosecutor needs in order to bring the charges.
And Alice is right. The criminal liability, the standard's going to be really high. You're going to have to show a lot more of this happening. Pervasiveness such that the corporation of the hospital really would know or should have known exactly what was going on, knew that this kind of behavior was rampant and did nothing about it. And even if you succeed, the best you're going to get, because once again, it's a corporation, is a fine. And it's going to be a statutory level fine. Those are usually pretty low. In the cases where corporations have been charged with negligent homicide, we're talking like $10,000, $15,000, $100,000 tops for a fine. And that just goes to the state. This is really, to the extent the corporation is liable, this is a much better case for civil action than it is for criminal action. Standards are different. In many ways, they're lower, and it would be the family that would be suing, the family that would be receiving any judgment. The judgment can be much higher. It can include things like punitive damages. So I understand the question and why people ask the question, and it's an interesting question legally, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really make sense to try and prosecute the hospital.
Another thing to think about, we've talked about this previously, where if you are a corporation, you have a board of directors or some sort of board that governs you. And if that board has an indication that there's some sort of misconduct within the organization, it behooves that corporation or that board of directors to actually hire someone to investigate themselves. We talked about how strange this seemed, that you would pay money for someone to investigate yourself. But the reason you do that is because you want to be the first to the punch. You would rather you yourself have created a report saying, we didn't realize there was so much misconduct. We paid some outside entity, usually a law firm, to investigate ourselves. That's how seriously we take it. And law enforcement, I know you're now coming to ask questions, but look, we're a step ahead of you. We realize what we've done. We didn't know because we're a big corporation and there's so many agents. We can't possibly know what everyone's doing until we did this investigation. And now because we know about this, here is what we propose we will do to make sure we are in compliance with the law, with regulations, with best practices, and kind of front load that issue. There are instances, and oftentimes, that there are these corporate compliance programs put into place for PR purposes, but also to avoid any sort of civil or criminal liability. You can imagine that, geez, if a prosecuting entity has to go through years of investigation, a lot of resources in order to investigate whether they can prosecute a corporate entity for pervasiveness of some conduct, they can do that or weigh it against the corporation self-reporting themselves and saying, mea culpa, we did wrong, but now we know what we should do to do better, and we're going to comply with all these things. You should give us time to come into compliance because it would behoove everyone. In this case, we're a hospital. We serve, millions of people a year. We have good doctors and good nurses on staff, and we are a cornerstone to this community for research, for curing people, for treatment. You don't want to take us down because we should be putting our resource to serving the public. If you're given those two choices, you can imagine the corporate compliance program that they're bringing themselves sounds really good, because don't you get to the same result, which is you want the situation to get better, as opposed to spending years and many resources to try and prosecute, where at the end of the day, the hospital might just owe some piddly fines and no one is really held responsible, or the environment's not actually made better because the hospital had to use all their resources in fighting the prosecution rather than pointing for themselves out what they did wrong. And that is something that a lot of corporations do. They jump to kind of coming up with their own compliance programs in order to avoid that liability. I don't know that that's what the hospital would have done here, but notice the hospital did immediately, terminate her when they found out. They took other steps to show that they were taking this seriously. That absolutely is a thumbs up in their direction, right? If they had done nothing, that makes them look bad. They may be covering themselves, absolutely, but the reason they're doing that is to try and show there's no pervasiveness of this culture. We did all the right things as soon as we knew about misconduct. We took actions to separate ourselves from that misconduct that has nothing to do with us.
Now, of course, the great irony of that is that's the same thing you wanted from RaDonda Vaught. You want her to explain exactly what went wrong to avoid it in the future. And by prosecuting her, arguably the incentives there are really bad. And I think the point Alice is making is same argument applies for the corporation. You want corporations to respond by admitting what they did wrong and to fix it as soon as possible. Like Alice said, this is a huge hospital. So many lives are going through this hospital. They need to fix it. They don't need to fight it. They don't need to act like they didn't do anything wrong to avoid some criminal liability. You'd much rather have them accept their mistakes and move forward. Obviously, you have the same thing with RaDonda Vaught, though I think one big distinction is she is much more directly involved in what happened here, and that's a reason to go ahead and prosecute her, whereas you might not do that for the hospital. Alice, I'm really excited to talk about one of the more unique sponsors we have on the show, the Jordan Harbinger Show. We have talked about this. It is a podcast you should definitely check out since you're a fan of high-quality, fascinating podcasts hosted by interesting people. This is a show that covers a wide range of topics through weekly interviews with heavy-hitting guests. And there are a ton of episodes you'll find interesting since you're a fan of this show. If you love true crime, check out the episode with Sammy the Bull Gravano and see how the mob really works. Or listen to Amanda Knox tell her harrowing story of false accusation.
There's an episode for everyone, no matter what you're into. The show covers stories like how a professional art forger somehow made millions of dollars while being chased by the feds and the mafia. Jordan's also done an episode all about birth control and how it can alter the partners we pick and how going on or off of the pill can change elements of our personalities. This podcast covers a lot, but one constant is Jordan's ability to pull useful pieces of advice from his guests. We really enjoy this show, and we think you will as well. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show. That's HARB as in boy, IN as in Nancy, GER on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey guys, whether you love true crime or comedies, celebrity interviews, news, or even motivational speakers, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue, right? And guess what? Now you can call the shots on your auto insurance too. Enter the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. The Name Your Price tool puts you in charge of your auto insurance by working just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, then they'll show you a variety of coverages that fit within your budget, giving you options. Now that's something you'll want to press play on. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to choose the best option for you, fast. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive Insurance. Quote today at Progressive.com to try the Name Your Price tool for yourself and join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Now, one thing people asked is what exactly, we talked about involuntary manslaughter, and we talked about an example being drunk driving, and we pointed out the distinction here. In drunk driving, you decide to drink. You decide to get behind the wheel of the car. Even if the accident itself is an accident and you didn't intend to hurt anyone, you did make decisions. You took positive steps that led to that. Here, we don't have that so much. There's no one saying that she took affirmative steps, or I don't think there's anybody saying. The prosecution kind of said it. They did charge her with reckless. Put that aside, because I don't think anybody thinks that was a good charge. The jury certainly didn't. We're really talking about involuntary manslaughter here. There was one thing the prosecution said, that when they said it, when I was listening to them make the argument, I actually didn't like it. But the more I think about it, the more I think it actually makes sense. They compared it, they made the drunk driving analogy that I just made. And then they said what RaDonda Vaught did was as if she was driving with her eyes closed. So it was as if she was doing this thing that's inherently dangerous, and she just didn't take the ordinary care that you would expect from someone. It was as if she got in the car, turned it on, started driving down the road, and, just closed her eyes and never opened them. And, yeah, she maybe didn't see the stop sign she ran. She didn't mean to run the stop sign, but it's because she wasn't actually paying attention to what she was doing. It's not quite that, because that's more of a willful blindness there if you decide to close your eyes. So maybe it's more you're driving down the road and you're just daydreaming. You just let yourself go. You don't take it as seriously as you should, and then you run over somebody because you ran a stop sign, even though you didn't mean to run the stop sign. Are you liable? And when you look at the things that she did and the combination of the things she did, what you see is someone who there were so many warning signs, so many red flags, so many things she could have done and should have seen that she didn't see. And when you combine all those things together, it almost, even though it's not willfully blind, there is a blindness there. There's just a lack of care that is so striking that it seems to reach the level of culpability that you need to charge someone with a crime.
Yeah, but I know it may go counter to your intuition that inaction itself can be negligence, but when you have a profession that requires action to reach the standard of care, that's why this comes in. And you see this honestly more in the context of medical malpractice, again, the civil side rather than the criminal side. But in the civil side, we often see that the causation prong can be your inaction. And that's very well known, as one of the elements to then show some sort of breach of your duty that results in damages. I know at gut, it may seem strange that then your inaction can lead to criminal liability. But here, she was hired in order to care for them. And like you said, Brett, those warning signs were the willfulness. And she says it herself. And that's part of the damaging part. She says she could have looked down at any time and seen the color of the top, that it said, paralyzing agent. She could have looked down and she could have seen that it was paralyzing agent. I think one of the parts that really felt almost willful, for me, at least from a legal perspective, was the fact that she had gotten the drug just the week before, and it had been the correct constitution. It was liquid. But in this particular day, it came out, and she didn't see the paralyzing agent, or maybe she didn't look down to see paralyzing agent. She didn't look down to see the color of the cap. And she had to read instructions in order to reconstitute the powder into a usable liquid form. And all of that you begin to see, even if she didn't mean to do anything, those are absolutely steps in the way where her inaction was actually a choice, right? And she says that herself, I could have if I had just looked down. And so inaction itself was a choice in kind of the stream of events when you look back to back at all the steps in which she had inaction that led to the fatal outcome.
And you got to remember, even though we're going to talk about what she did here in a second, and it sounds bad, nevertheless, she is a sympathetic person. She is a sympathetic defendant, and there are reasons for everything that happened, and there are reasons to be sympathetic to her. And I think the jury got that to a certain extent. We've talked a lot about, and the news has talked a lot about the fact that RaDonda Vaught was convicted, but she wasn't convicted of the lead charge. The lead charge was reckless homicide. That's what the prosecution was really going for. The jury rejected that, and they did not believe that Vaught consciously disregarded the risk to her patient. In some ways, it almost reminds me of A Few Good Men. I don't know if you guys have seen A Few Good Men. If you haven't, you got to go see A Few Good Men, because it's amazing. It's a terrific movie. I remember exactly where I was. I was watching it with my parents in New Orleans on New Year's Eve at a theater that had just been vacated. This is 1992 by the Alabama football team, who then would go on the next day to defeat the Miami Hurricanes for the national championship. Probably the greatest weekend of my life. So I remember exactly where I was when I saw A Few Good Men.
I don't even know where you're going with this right now.
Well, I just really want to tell that story.
I thought you did.
And as a matter of fact, we watched the movie, and as we were going in to watch it, who was coming out? The Alabama football team, because that was the movie they had went to see that night. So we actually saw it in the same theater. This is all irrelevant. What is relevant is at the end of that movie, spoiler alert, the guys who have been charged, they are acquitted of the main crime. They're acquitted of murder, but they're convicted of conduct unbecoming of a Marine. And the reason is because, they didn't kill the guy, But what they did was still problematic, and I think that's what the jury saw here. Now, RaDonda attempted to make a defense that, on the one hand, went for this whole, I didn't really kill her. That was a weakness, I think, in the defense. But I think the bigger part of the defense really kind of goes to what people feel, what you're feeling about this case. And look, we talk about jury nullification sometimes. What that means is, yeah, you basically go to a jury and say, yeah, my client's guilty, but you shouldn't convict because of all these other reasons that have nothing to do with the law. And that's sort of what they went for here. I mean, they basically said, look, everybody makes mistakes. We're all human. This is an error. And they went into the difficulty, the stress, the pressure, the complexity of critical care nurses and what they have to do, the long hours, the lack of good staffing, the incredible responsibility that's on their shoulders, the limited time to do the duties of the job. And they hammered Vanderbilt University. They presented Vanderbilt as throwing Vaught under the bus while also using the university's considerable sway in the state of Tennessee and the city of Nashville to limit the information that even the police received to only that was most damning to Vaught and didn't paint Vanderbilt in a bad light. Now look, the defense is not arguing that the facts of the case are really in dispute. Vaught knew, as she had said, that her actions had led to the death of Murphy. She never denied that. Her remorse was absolutely clear. The question was whether or not this kind of accident was enough to lead to criminal liability. And the defense, they pointed to some testimony that was pretty powerful from them, including from the pharmacy unit at Vanderbilt, who explained that they had an entire committee dedicated to addressing the many medication errors that happen at a hospital every year. In fact, they didn't just have one, they had 3 separate committees, all dedicated to these kind of errors, figuring out why they happened, and fixing them in the future. And they also noted that, yeah, RaDonda is somewhat to blame, but she's not totally to blame. They pointed out that the doctors who were involved in this PET scan actually delayed placing the order for Versed until after the radioisotope for the PET scan had already been given to Murphy. So if you know how this works, the reason they're able to image you is actually inject you with an isotope, and the image is looking at the isotope. You only have so much time to do that between when you inject it and when you have to do the scan. So ordinarily, this Versed order would not have been an emergency. But it was in this situation, and that delay by the doctors is what made it one. So Vaught was rushed. She needed the drugs. She needed them now. And to the extent the prosecution argued she should have gone through all these different steps, it was important to remember the real-life situation she was in. And I think this is what so many nurses have grabbed onto. Yeah, there's a 10-step process you're supposed to go through. In real life, it's hard to go through those 10 steps because you got a patient who's waiting on you. And you need to get them the drug that they need. And I think this was particularly powerful in regards to that reckless homicide. I think this was the kind of argument and evidence that did lead to her being acquitted of that, even if she was convicted of these lesser included offenses.
So let's go over the summary of what Vaught did wrong. Vaught did not pull the medical record for Murphy. If she had, she would have seen the order for midazolam. When Vaught did not know the drug, she should have called the pharmacy. And weirdly, despite saying that she did not know the generic term for the drug, she had pulled midazolam the day before. So you would think she did know what it was, especially since she had such recent interaction with it before. Third, when she overrode the system, she dispersed the first drug that came up after she typed in VE. This was not Versed. It was vecuronium, and that's because vecuronium, VEC, with a C coming before an R in Versed, would come up alphabetically first. She did not notice the very obvious red warning label on top of the bottle that read, quote, paralyzing agent. I mean, take a look at this picture. There's a reason that it's a different color. It's red so that you don't have to read any words to recognize that there's a warning affiliated with this. Fifth, Vaught did not notice that the bottle was 5 times larger than the correct bottle, the same bottle she had used just the day before. Sixth, she did not read the warning labels on the bottle itself, and she admitted that repeatedly. Seventh, even though Vaught knew that Versed was a liquid, and although she thought it was odd that this was a powder, she nevertheless didn't think it was a red flag when the drug she had was a powder. And again, this is pretty powerful when put into the perspective that she had pulled midazolam just the day before. So one day previous, she had pulled it and it was a liquid, not a powder. And it's probably from it's the same pharmacy, the same hospital. And so it would be strange to have it one day be liquid and the next day be powder, but she disregarded this fact. Eighth, although she did not read the warning, Vaught did read the instructions for reconstituting the drug from a powder to a liquid. However, the warning was above this instruction in even larger font than the instruction, as was the name of the drug, vecuronium bromide, a much longer name than Versed. So she herself acknowledges she read the instructions for reconstituting it. These instructions were smaller and below that red label and the warning sign of paralyzing agent. Ninth, getting the drug from the distribution machine did not require Vaught to do something called a, quote, blind count. This is a requirement when distributing an opioid that she was well aware of.
And, as we walk through these things, the crazy thing about this, these are all the things that she did or didn't do that she should have done or not done. And any one of them would have prevented this. If she had done any one of these things, you wouldn't have had this happen. And this is all going to whether or not you have a negligent homicide. But we're nowhere near done. At this point, she has the vecuronium, and she's actually walking around for 5 minutes with this drug in her hand. She never looks at it. Not once. Even though she had to override the machine, even though it's not her patient. At no point does she just look at the bottle and read the name of what she has. She has an RN who she's training that day. She does not have this person double check the drug, as is actually standard procedure following an override. So you're doing an override. The whole point is that safety precaution of the machine giving you the right drug has been overridden. You now have the drug that you picked, not the machine. And the procedure is, check, make sure I got the right thing. She doesn't do that. 12, she doesn't scan the medication with a scanner. There is a scanner available in the area where she retrieved the drugs. The weird thing about this is she's a relatively new nurse, and there's a big divide in nurses. New nurses scan everything because that's how they came up. Old nurses, they're not as big in scanning, but she should have been someone who wanted to scan. She doesn't use the scanner to scan the drugs, which if she had scanned it, it would have come up and warning, like all sorts of things, like don't use this. By the time she gets to the PET scan area, there are no scanners. There's no scanner down there, so she can't do it. So if she wanted to scan then, she'd have to go back up. She's obviously not going to do that. She sort of missed her opportunity. So these are all the things she did that did not alert her to the fact that she didn't have the right drug. But that wasn't it. There was another big part of the prosecution. You hear it described as she gave the wrong drug. And that's true. But the other thing she did that the prosecution really focused on, she didn't do the things she should have done even if she had given the right drug. So let's talk about some of those. She did not assess Murphy's vitals before preparing the medication, and this was a mistake. Even if she had given her the correct drug, she's supposed to make sure that she's ready to receive it. Now, she's only supposed to give her 1 to 2 milliliters of Versed. Now, basically, the whole idea here is you give the one stage and then you give the other. 1 to 2 milliliters, very little Versed. But another nurse testified at trial that she gave her at least a third of the syringe that she had and as much as half. The syringe that she had was a 10 milliliter syringe, so you're seeing 3 to 5 here. Now, this is something we brought up on the Good Nurse, Bad Nurse podcast, and she pointed out that the reason she might have done this is because Versed is a very thick drug. It burns going in, and so it's possible she would have thought she was diluting it. So she would have wanted to dilute the Versed with a lot of saline solution, so it's not as thick, so it doesn't burn as much. More liquid, less drug per milliliter. The problem is, obviously, she didn't give her Versed. She gave her Vecuronium, so she ends up giving her all of this Vecuronium, this like 5 milliliters of Vecuronium, which is why it was so deadly when it was given. Now, as the injection is being made, Murphy actually complained. She says it burns. Vaught didn't stop to see why. Instead, she slowed sort of the injection rate and asked if that was better. This is another thing where Versed actually set her up for failure. Versed tends to burn as it's going in. Nurses know that, so they don't see it as a red flag. It would have been a red flag, just generally speaking. That would have been something maybe you want to stop, make sure there's nothing wrong. But because Versed was known to have the side effect, you can see why she just continued to go. So after she gives her the Versed, she doesn't do an assessment. Now, typically, when you're administering this drug, the nurse would be expected to give 1 milliliter. Remember, this is 1 to 2 milliliters. You might think, what in the world does that mean? Tell her how much to give her. Well, the reason they do that is because you give the 1, you see if the patient's doing okay, you see how they're feeling, and then only if more is needed do you give that additional milliliter. She didn't do that. In fact, she didn't give the dose in 2 stages, as would have been proper procedure. Even if it were Versed, she pushed it all in at once. And instead of giving an assessment, she makes the mistake that I think really sinks her. She leaves after the drug is given. She does not stay to monitor the patient. She doesn't stay to make sure there's not an adverse reaction. Even to Versed, she leaves. And the only person with Murphy at that point is a PET scan tech who is not qualified to monitor Murphy or her reaction to the drug, even if it were Versed. In fact, Vaught never returns to check on Murphy. If she had stayed to monitor her patient as she should have done, she would almost certainly have noticed the signs that she had been given the wrong drug, and she could have administered a drug that would reverse the effects. And it is almost definitely the case that this would have saved Murphy's life. So you're left with a situation where this nurse, whatever else is going on, just the cold hard facts, she ignored multiple steps that would have prevented her from using Vecuronium instead of Versed. But the problem with her defense is this is not a simple case of giving the wrong drug. She also did not administer it as protocols would require. She didn't give the 1 milliliter and then check. She didn't wait to see what would happen to her patient. There were so many opportunities for her to stop this from happening, but at each step, she either ignored proper procedure or she didn't pay enough attention to what were some obvious warning signs. And that's why, as I said earlier, whether this case should have been brought or not, I think just the cold legal analysis, it's pretty clear that Vaught was guilty of negligent homicide.
Especially when you put all of the errors in a row like that, and that's what you do in trial, right? This would have come out over many different witnesses and many days of testimony, but when you put it back to back to back to back, what you see is just time after time that this death could have been prevented. And of course, I know many of you, especially those of you who have experience in the medical field, who are nurses, as we're reading this, you're probably shaking your head thinking there is a response to each of the things that we just said she did incorrectly. But this was what was presented at trial. And while I believe a lot of the argument against why any of these missteps shouldn't lead to criminal liability would be that the system caused her to do this, while that may be true, We don't know the prosecutors in this case, but it very well may be that this case was brought because they knew they could easily meet all the elements, and they were looking for a case in order to shake up this complacent environment as described by Vaught herself. I don't know that for a fact, but that is something that you take into account when medical boards and also the law enforcement community often bring cases to a prosecutor's office, and they may have an aim in mind. You have to stop, the overprescribing of this type of drug, or there's a just pernicious environment where nurses are overworked and rushed and they don't follow protocol, and it's very dangerous and it causes 250,000 deaths a year, that sort of thing. You need to bring a case in order to just shake up the system. And it's possible that factored into why they brought this case. Now, whether they should have done it and whether it will have that effect, I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think instead it was overreached, and instead you have this woman who admitted she's done really all the things after her mistake that you would hope a nurse would do. Immediately confessing, immediately taking responsibility. She loses her license, she loses her job. And from at least a prosecutor's perspective, I'm thinking this woman is no longer a danger because she can't practice anymore. She didn't do this intentionally. The likelihood of her recidivating, of doing this again, are just about nil because she does not have the license in order to practice anymore. I know I would look very closely at this case, and I would probably be convinced not to bring it because of those factors. But that's not what happened in this case. And as you hear all of those mistakes back to back, it's clear. It is clear that the elements are met. Then the question is whether this case should have been brought or whether these laws should be applied in this context.
And, I have so many thoughts on this. We talked for an hour and a half, the Good Nurse, Bad Nurse podcast. I look forward to talking to some of you guys. I want to get vocal about this. One thing I'm absolutely sure of, and I just have no question about this, that she is guilty of the crimes for which she was convicted, just based on what the statute says and what she did. I just don't have any question about that. And I think most people's arguments are not about that. We talk about prosecutorial discretion. We've talked about it in this episode. Just because someone is guilty doesn't mean you should bring a charge. And I feel like most people's arguments about this case are not she's not guilty. It's nevertheless, this charge shouldn't have been brought because of the effect it's going to have. That's a great discussion. It's a hard discussion. It's a tough discussion. And it's a tough discussion if you're a prosecutor when you have someone who has died. You have a real victim, someone who suffered and died because of these actions. And you're being asked not to seek justice for that person. And that's a tough call. And I get why it's a tough call. A couple things I would say to those of you out there who are nurses. I've read this a lot. There, but for the grace of God go I. Could have happened to me. I've heard a lot of that. I just want you to seriously think about that. Is that true? I have no doubt there are lots of you out there who have pulled the wrong drug from the cabinet, who maybe even given the wrong drug to someone, or gave the right drug to somebody, but you didn't monitor them because you knew it was the right drug and you knew what would happen and it wasn't worth your time. There are all sorts of things that she did that you may have done. But remember, we're talking like 20 different steps that she didn't take, any one of which would have changed the outcome here. And I wonder how many of you out there, it really is the case, sort of there, but for the grace of God go I. I wonder how often all 20 of these things are true. The other thing I would say, I think those of you who've said this is a systemic problem, like the Johns Hopkins article said, that's 100% true. It is kind of mind-blowing that the third leading cause of death in the United States is the result of medical errors. It's the result of actions people take. Even if they're mistakes, actions people take. Every other cause of death going down, you got to go a long way before you get to people. Heart disease is number 1. Cancer is number 2. Respiratory illness is going to be number 4. Any number of other diseases are going to fill up the rest, maybe even of your top 10. At some point you're going to get to car accidents at some point you're going to get to fatal shootings, but those are going to be in the tens of thousands of people. We're talking 250,000 people who die every year because of medical mistakes. It feels like there needs to be some sort of systemic discussion, and I think the nurses who are pointing to that are really doing a really good service, and you hate to see anyone suffer for a greater good, but you hope that as a result of this prosecution, this conversation about how we can change the systemic problems can lead to a better situation. And the things that have been done are not the answer. I mean, the things that have been done, it seems like, are just more warnings. And one of the problems is this warning fatigue. You see so many warnings as a nurse, like you just don't even pay attention to them. I remember when my son was in the NICU, I mean, obviously, you know, I'm like staring at the oxygen level like it's the number goes up 1, great. The number goes down 1, there's a big problem. And warnings are just going off all the time. And I'm like, there's a warning. Somebody should come do something. And eventually a nurse would come by and turn off the warning. They'd be like, it's no big deal. Don't worry about it. Right? And you kind of wonder, why do we have so many warnings that don't matter? And what it does is set up a situation where you're just trained to ignore them. You know, we live in Tornado Alley down here. We got storm warnings all the time. And it just makes you immune to them. Like, oh yeah, another storm. And then a tornado comes and it's huge and it kills a whole bunch of people. And you wonder why. Nobody paid attention to the warning. It's because you've been telling us there's going to be a tornado for 10 weeks straight. Nothing happened. That is similar to what happened here. I think there is a huge systemic problem. I have no answers, so don't come to me. I have no idea how to fix this. But I do hope, if nothing else, that this case creates maybe a conversation that can lead in that direction. And I think that's the best we can hope for.
There's so much more to say. I think we have to, maybe as soon as this episode comes out, let's just do a Get Vocal, because I don't think we have enough hours in order to fully give the conversation its due here. But I agree with you, Brett. These are huge
implications
that it's going to have, and I hope it's for the good. It's very possible that Vaught didn't have to choose to go to trial. Obviously, you know that just statistically, most cases are pleaded out before some sort of plea deal is reached before going to trial. So a small percentage of indicted cases actually go to trial. But this was a very interesting question. I think it could have come... It could have been a jury nullification case. I do not think it was a situation where the prosecution wasn't able to meet the elements, but I can imagine that the defense thought, well, this is a situation where jury nullification can really kick in. Jury nullification, remember, is where the jury decides that they don't want to follow the law, that even if the elements are met here, no, she shouldn't be convicted criminally, even though she is guilty of the crimes charged. But it didn't happen here. In some ways it did. They acquitted her of the greater charge. But keep this in mind. I mean, I really do think that this should spur a lot of thinking on your own part as to, what we want in our criminal justice system and how we move forward from this and how we support our medical community recognizing these systemic problems.
And I'll just say one more thing and we'll close it up. A lot of the arguments that have been made are really sentencing arguments. It's one thing to say that she is guilty per the law. It's another thing to say that she should spend any time in prison because of it. I hope that the judge will give her the lowest possible sentence. I don't know if there's some mandatory minimums he's got to work with, but this is not someone who should be punished. She's been punished already. The conviction is punishment. She's lost her license. She's never going to practice as a nurse again. And she's going to live with this, and I think is living with this for the rest of her life, this mistake that she made. So I hope that when sentencing comes around, the judge takes all that into consideration. I know you guys have thoughts. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Hello to you. Hello to all of you who are hearing this episode early and ad-free on Patreon. Hello to everybody who's watching on YouTube. We love all you guys. You guys are awesome. I hope you will still leave those 5-star reviews to make up for the fact that Alice giggles too much. We need all the 5 stars we can get. Well, Alice, this has been an interesting one. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation about this one, and I look forward to hearing all about it. Do you have anything else you want to add before we sign off for tonight?
Just one thing. Remember, this is so sad that Murphy died in a very, very seemingly painful way. I don't know what she suffered in her last moments, but it must have been horrific. And also devastating is that Vaught, who has trained in this area, and her job is to care for others, to make things better, to make people get better, and to see people walk out of hospitals. I don't know her individually, but seeing how she confessed so quickly and how apologetic she was from the get-go, she never minimized her role in all of this before the medical board or before law enforcement. It leads me to believe that she herself is living in her own type of torture, knowing that she caused Murphy immense pain and suffering before she passed away. I can't imagine the weight that must have on her as well. And so there are many victims in this case. There are many lives that have been shattered because of this case. And while there are very interesting philosophical and legal and factual questions surrounding this, at heart, remember that many lives are forever changed because of this as well.
Yeah, this is a case that'll make you think. It definitely will. And I can't wait to hear you guys' opinions on this. Well, that is all we have for tonight. But we will be back next week with a new case, new questions, and hopefully some new answers. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Okay. By the way, I've been watching Only Murders in the Building. Did you watch that?
Yeah, I did.
It's really good. I'm
really
only
funny.
like
it's like very
4 episodes into it.
It's very meta for our life.
I know.
It's like very meta. When they have, I don't know if you guys, it doesn't give anything away, but they have like their diehard fans who sit outside with like homemade t-shirts of their faces, and they're like, and they also like all they do is criticize them, but they love them.
Of course. Yes. Yes. That's very realistic. That's the most realistic thing I've heard.
They're like, I've given up my whole life to sit here. Also, I hate the way that you breathe. And it's just like so great.
That's awesome.
And it's like, so do you like us or do you not like us?
Yes.
No, I thought
the
the
eternal
writing.
question.
I thought the writing and the acting was fantastic. I also really love all of those actors.
So far, it's been great.
Short are just so fantastic.
I was really impressed, or have been really impressed with Selena Gomez. I didn't know what to expect from her, but she's like fantastic.
Yeah.
Stream the biggest movies and TV shows for free on PlutoTv. Watch movies like Titanic and G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra, plus TV shows like CSI and Star Trek: The Next Generation. Starting this month, check out the 24/7 Stargate channel exclusively on PlutoTv. Plus hundreds of channels and thousands of movies and TV shows absolutely free. Download the free PlutoTv app on your favorite streaming device and start watching today.